I'm going to be telling you about The Half-Breed and our efforts to restore The Half-Breed, a 1916 film filmed by Allan Dwan, starring Douglas Fairbanks. And while we're waiting for the curtain to open, there we go. I'd like to go ahead and dedicate this presentation to Tracy Gossel, who was the patron saint of this project. It was her idea, it was her guts, determination, drive, research, you name it. It wouldn't have happened, and I wouldn't be standing here today if it weren't for Tracy. So, what I'm going to share with you in the next 30 minutes or so is our quest to return The Half-Breed back to the screen. I'd like to begin by introducing the star of the film, Douglas Fairbanks. And I had a selection of clips, but I thought we'd start with this. And this is Douglas Fairbanks as Sleeping Water, the orphaned son raised by John Bowers. And that was in a 35mm diacetate pâté print. And then from a later restoration from Cinematheque Comparison, we have Douglas Fairbanks again, raised again by John Bowers, this time also as Sleeping Water. And I'll give you ample opportunity to check out the tan line. Now we have Douglas Fairbanks as Le Dermonte, though I can't speak French and that's horribly mangled, but he has just been raised by a white benefactor, a white man that's educated, but he doesn't have a name. We see a little more deterioration. The tan line is actually a little more pronounced in this one. And now we have him again. He's leaping Brook, and John Bowers has raised him from a baby. And he's still going to climb up on that rock one more time. We're just going to make sure this is embedded in your frontal lobes. You'll never look at Doug quite the same again. And finally, we have a different one. We're introducing Doug as in a completely different manner. He has his clothes on, but he is a strange-looking man, but he's known as Wilderness Man, who lives in a tree. And, you know, frankly, nobody you would be interested in, my dear. Maybe she is interested. But he's really Dave Carson. So who knew? He could be Leaping Brook, he could be Lo Dermonte, he's Lo Dorman, he's Leaping Brook, he's Wilderness Man, he's Dave Carson. Who is this mysterious man? Well, we're going to find out. So The Half-Breed was released July 30, 1916. It was created by the Fine Arts Company, distributed originally by Triangle. It was, as I mentioned earlier, directed by Allan Dwan. It was photographed by Victor Flaming and supervised by D.W. Griffith. So if you want to talk about an all-star production crew, that's a hard one to beat. And it was starring our good friend Douglas Fairbanks wearing his clothes in this early promotional image. What I wanted to demonstrate with those clips, among other things, aside from the obvious demonstration, was the sort of the extreme variety of forms that the film took fairly quickly after its release. And that was actually presented one of the more challenging aspects of the entire project. And I get the next slide, please. So for taking on this project and what we were trying to do with it, there were really three aspects that we needed to address. One was the continuity, is what was the narrative structure, what it was the proper original 1916 narrative structure, meaning the plot, the shot sequence, the sequence of the sequences, and how it was all put together. There were the titles, the language of the film itself. We often tend to gloss over titles as like, oh, there's titles. But it is really the text of the film. And in this case, even more than the image, the titles were sort of the holy grail. Like we've searched forever. We searched more for titles and text than we did for photographic image. And then, but not to exclude the photographic image. That is obviously the heart of what motion pictures are all about. But all three of these were very separate aspects of the project, and all three sort of different avenues we had to go down. So I wanted to talk a little bit about each one and then sort of bring it back together in the end. So talking about continuity, for instance. So the film was created in 1916, released in 1916, distributed by Triangle. We have very little today in terms of the original documentation from the production. So we don't have scripts, we don't have production records. What we do have are contemporary reviews, trade magazine reviews, newspaper articles, and we have the original short story, Bret Hart's short story, In the Carquinez Woods, on which the film is based. So a couple challenges here. One is that the film, after it was released, it wasn't long afterwards that Triangle ran into their own difficulties. So eventually dissolving, the rights went to S.A. Lynch, a film distributor, and then in 1918 further subdivided on what was called the states' rights basis. So ownership of the film or distribution rights of the film basically scattered to the winds. And on top of this fact, you have the fact that the film was never copyrighted, so it was pretty well open season on the half-breed. So we're trying to research what this film originally looked like and what was the story. So again, like I mentioned, we go to the trade magazines. And a good source for us here is Variety magazine. And don't worry about a spoiler, I've redacted anything that gives away the end. I thought you'd all hate me if you can read as far as you want, that's exposition. You might stop wherever you feel comfortable, but I'm not giving away the end. So it tells the story of basically Douglas Fairbanks, raised as a child, orphaned, raised by a hermit, exiled, developed complications exist, 2 women come into his life, more complications exist. There's a climax and there's a resolution, but it follows what we expect the film to be. It follows the narrative of the short story. And this is one example, but we have numerous examples from other magazines, reviews, etc., and they're all consistently tell this story. So we can move forward to 1919, and we have actually quite a bit of documentation. I'll give you some examples here. Moving on to 1919, the story is completely different. It seems from the story to revolve more around Teresa, one of the characters. She's a prisoner. She encounters Lowe, kills the deputy. It's very confusing, and it's especially confusing if you know what it started as. But it's still a corkingly good drama. We get to 1924, and we found actually not much of a write-up, but we have found advertising material for a title, and there's, that's the iconic shot there, so you know where that came from, of the famed 29 or 49. And it seems to have been morphed into some sort of, at least, tale of the gold rush era. Well, the original film has nothing to do with the gold rush. Nothing. There's no gold miners. Early in the film, there's one introduction of one character, and they call him a prospector. And that's it. There's nothing else about the gold rush that's in this film. But again, it was, and we don't have a good description of what the narrative that was in this or in some of these other reissues. But it's fair to assume, based on the dates and based on the fact it was not copyrighted, based on the fact that versions were circulating all over the place, and that you went from an early Fairbanks film to 1924, and later on where it became a huge star, that people were finding ways to capitalize on this footage, create a new product, and get it out into the public. You see this a lot with Chaplin also, right? The early Keystones were often retitled, re-edited, released again as new Chaplin films. And it's not hard to imagine that we had a lot of new Fairbanks product, which was basically footage from the half-breed. So we have the documentation, and then which spawned the search for film material. And we found a lot, and we found not much, all at the same time. So what is out there are a large number of 16 millimeter reduction prints, abbreviated versions, show-at-home versions, versions were put together for schools, etc. This is a sort of a sample of the titles, title cards put together, but it's not the end of them all. But at the end of the day, we found there were three sources that were elemental to putting the film together. The first was a 35 millimeter fragmentary and highly damaged print that's in the collection of the Library of Congress. It is missing a couple of reels. The film is 5 reels originally. And this print came to the library in 1978 by way of the infamous Dawson City find. And I'm sure some of you sort of know the history of this. This was, ironically, in Dawson City in the Yukon. We're back to the gold rush again. And it was literally an abandoned swimming pool that was filled with film, had been buried, frozen in permafrost, and covered over with dirt. You were at the end of the distribution line, and it was not worth it to ship them back. So off they went and were rediscovered in 1978 when they were excavating to put in a building for construction. So the films had been laying underground for, literally thousands of canisters, had been laying underground for decades. They were dug out, thawed out, and not in the world's greatest shape, and you'll see some clips, you'll see what the damage looks like. And there was a pro and con to this. Unfortunately, the photographic damage to the image is so severe, it really wasn't usable except when we really had to use it. But it was the closest, it was an S.H. Lynch release, so it was as close as we could get to 1916, to what it would have looked like, what the sequences look like, and more importantly, for those reels, we had original titles, and I'll talk about more titles in a bit. In addition, our research, we came to the Cinematheque Française, who has a gorgeous print from 1924. It's a re-release issue from TriStone. It's complete, and I put complete in quotes because it's the complete TriStone release. So it's not the complete 1916 release. We know there's things missing, but it has a begin title, it has an end title, it's all there in between. It is a complete film. But it's not our 1916 complete film. But the great news is the photographic quality was excellent. It was really clear, it's really sharp, and it gave us a solid basis. Every single photographic shot that is in this print has ended up in our reconstruction. One thing about the reissue, though, and this is what happens, the film had been retitled, so it does not have the 1916 titles which had language from Bret Hart's story, and Anita Loos gets some credit in there too. I'm not sure exactly how much was. Text is very heavily leans towards Bret Hart, but Anita Loos had a hand in that as well. So unfortunately, we didn't have titles directly that we could use from there, at least not a whole entire substitution. Also in the Cinematheque collection, which was fabulous, is they do have a large number of the triangle papers, which included the title script, not for the 1916, but they have the script for the TriStone, which is actually a little different from the print, which came in very helpful because there were a couple gaps we needed to fill in, and we had text that we could semi-rely on from that script to use. And then we come to, actually, and I should mention, and this is the point where we found the print, we got a great conversation, we had a great conversation with Celine, who you will meet as soon as I get off the stage. And we really sort of bonded over this film and created a partnership. So at this point, when this conversation started and really got going, this is when our quest to let's see what we can find of the half-breed turned into let's partner on getting this restoration done. So this is, from everything I'm presenting, I want to make sure is really clear. This is really a joint effort and a joint project between the San Francisco Film Festival, Silent Film Festival, and the Cinematheque Comparison, and they've been wonderful partners. And I really want to actually thank them at this point. So our third element that we discovered, among all the 16mm abridgments, was a print in the collection of Lobster films, which we don't know where it's from. There's no attribution, there's no distributor, there's no copyright, there's no anything. We don't know, and Lobster doesn't know, or Serge Bromberg, if you know Serge. They don't know what's the heritage or what's the genealogy of this print, but there it is. It is an abridgment, it's a re-release. It is, to say the least, been severely retitled and re-edited. Now, as you noticed earlier when that was the last introduction I showed of Doug Fairbanks, all of a sudden he's Wilderness Man and he's Dave Carson. Not only in this print is all the titles are changed, it's a completely different story. The climax is in the beginning, the love interest actually ends up flip-flopping, the end is different. And it's a nightmare because, well, it's a beautiful thing, and it's a nightmare all at the same time. But, and of course, in 16mm, the resolution and the image quality is not the best. It's blurry. You blow it up into 35mm on a big screen. It is not sharp, crisp, and beautiful like 35. But it had unique sequences that were not present in the Cinematheque version, and were not in the Library of Congress version. Perhaps, for among other reasons, there's reels missing out of the Library of Congress version. So these are sequences that very likely may have been they were in the 1916 version, and they probably are in the missing reels of the Library of Congress version. So I want to talk a little bit about titles, because titles, as I mentioned, were a considerable element of our challenge here. More so than we would have, you normally expect. You put the thing together, the titles are the titles, and there you are. But we had a little different story here. So next slide. So looking at the title language, again, remember we only have a subset of what the original titles are. We have no documentation of what the missing ones, what the text actually was. So a lot of our quest was finding more original triangle titles. And share with you some of the things we ran into. So here on the left this is a solid title. This is Library of Congress. It's gorgeous. It has the triangle logo. It is Bret Hart's snappy text, which is just great. Pastor Wynn's motherless daughter, expensively educated, she was profoundly ignorant in 2 languages, with a trained misunderstanding of music, painting, and a natural and faultless taste in dress. It's gorgeous. I mean, the language is, it really speaks to the author of the film. And so the text is great, it looks right, it has original character names, it has original character roles. And when we first came across the 16mm abridgment, we thought, score! Look at this. It's got the right typeface, it's got the triangle logo. We found it. We found another source for original titles. But look at this stupid thing. It's not Pastor Wynn, who is the real name, it's Judge Decatur. And Nellie is turned into Peggy. And her caller, like this title, is dull and boring. They faked us out. So not only is this wherever this came from, it's represented as the original title and faked us out, but it's not. So all the titles there, we got very excited and then very disappointed within a very short amount of time. But of course, even that's not that simple. So within the Library of Congress print, so within our Holy Grail, this is the original, this is 1916, this is as close we're going to get to the source. We have yet another, here's a good one, right? You've got the logo, you've got the text, it's all great. And over here in the same print, there are about a dozen titles that are clearly inserted later by whoever knows. Right, the text is, the title is the same, the font is the same, but it's bigger. I don't know if you can see it in this rendition here on the screen, but the triangle logo looks like it's been drawn by a 12-year-old. And it has this text, Triangle Play Corporation, on the bottom. It's not hard to spot when you run into one of these titles. They're almost all, well, they are all expository, right? There's never character dialogue or something like that. They're always setting a scene. They're always, and now we're in the town. They're basically always telling you something that you can tell, and often with an editorial comment like you get there. And they're worded kind of clumsy. I mean, the original titles, like I said, are snappy, and they're just nice. And those are like, yeah. So, and just to complete the story, we have, let's talk about, again, a comparison of the retitled version, the Tri-Stone re-release. So on this side, we have Library of Congress, 35 millimeter. And you see things that are a little more terse here, which is nice. The original version moves quickly. So you have Sheriff Dunn, and they tell you that he's the betrayer of Lowe's mother. And this is all in the first 5 minutes of the film, so I'm not giving you anything here. Don't worry. Over here, they feel compelled to tell you more that's not particularly interesting. You say he's the betrayer of Silver Fawn, who is Doug's mother, but in the original, they never give her a name. She's just the mother. And they tell you that he's on his way to the church in the morning. Well, and it's sort of that thing where they tell you and then they show you. In the original version, they knew that the next frame was going to show you him walking to church or in front of the church. But I would say the less elegant title sort of so they sort of belabor the point in terms of telling you more than you need to know or the more that you need to care. So the result is the Library of Congress continuity moves a little faster, and it feels a little better. So I'll pull all this back together, so I'm putting the elements out there for you. So first we have the continuity, then we talked about titles and the choices we have to make. And then the last element is the image restoration. Because it all goes together. These are moving images after all. So 95%, I never calculated a percentage, of the Library of Congress and the Cinematheque Française 35 millimeter elements are shot for shot identical. They're in the same sequence, it's the same shot, it's the same camera, it's exactly the same. But there were a couple times when it's not the same. And it's not so much that if you know your silent film construction history, you know that they would create an A negative and a B negative, or for export, for instance. So you'd have, may have a negative or a prints created with one set of shots and another one created with substandard shots, or shot with a parallel camera, so the shots are a little different, but they're almost the same. What we have here is, on occasion, 5% of the time, we had different shots for the same sequence. And in one case, which I'll show you, it's really just an aesthetic thing. And for a second one, it actually gives you a little different insight into the characters. So let's run this first one. And so this is from this, and I've taken out the titles, so those are the blacks. So this is in the Cinematheque print. And you can see the picture's gorgeous, it's nice and clear. This is the raw scan, so the contrast is low, and you can see it's all in medium shots. So they have their conversation, he grabs his forehead. Okay, now here we are again, the camera's a little closer. This is the Library of Congress, you can see the decomposition. But we're in, the medium shot is a little, and then we go to close-up for this scene. And aesthetically, frankly, I like the close-up better, but the material damage is so severe, there's really not really much you can do with that. You know, if you can imagine, what's left of that print is 3 reels that pretty well look like that. So the other one here, this is a little more interesting to me, to sort of demonstrate the differences. So I'll show you two clips. The first one is this little confrontation in the street with the sheriff and Mr. Fairbanks. And there's a couple alternate shots in there, but what you really get is, and what happens a lot with something's retitled, is the title won't necessarily exactly match the emotions of what's on their faces. If they change, they kind of like think, well, if we change the title a little bit, it'll change the meaning. But sometimes you get this weird mismatch of, that title said this, and then he's, you know, it's an angry title and he's smiling or something like that. And in the Library of Congress version, so we'll show it this way, and then we'll show the Library of Congress version, and you'll see that with the different title and extending that shot, which is abbreviated in this version, sort of the whole meaning of what that little interchange changes. And this is one case where we actually included in the restoration the more damaged material, just because it really added to the narrative. Where the first one, it was not so much. So let's go ahead and roll this clip. So here's Doug coming up, as you can see. Now this is a pretty mean title. Your father was the kind of man that would live with a squaw. And you get a serious reaction, and then you get, he's joking. He's like, why? Okay, so here it is in the Library of Congress, the same version, with a couple different shots, actually. You'll see Doug's raccoon tail flow in front of his face. But the same exchange, my father is a white man. Oh, but there's all kinds of white men. And then you get a smirk, and then you realize there's irony in that statement. This, you know, Doug is going, yeah, there are all kinds of white men, you know, and yeah, look at you guys. And the humor in his face that he's reflecting there is, the joke is in his head, yeah, there's all kinds of white men, like you guys. But you don't get that either in the retitle, or, so there's some color in there that by putting the right titles back in the photography, it sort of adds more of an experience or an understanding of what was really going on. But like I said, I wanted to demonstrate here, like I said, 95% of these films are the exact same DNA. You know, we can go frame for frame. This is Library of Congress on this side, Cinematheque on the other side, and obviously this is the exact same source, right? The splice, the dirt, the damage, the scratches, it's identical. You know, in fact, frankly, the only way you can tell it apart is on this Library of Congress frame. You can see a little nitrate damage encroaching on the right side. But it's the same material. Wherever they split, it's like genealogy. Wherever they split, you know, there's a common ancestor, right? There's Lucy in Africa that spawned them all. Even with the same print, you have different generations. Now, these are two adjacent shots. So the shot on the left comes first, and that's followed by the right. The one on the left, you can see it's fuzzy. It's deeper contrast. It just doesn't look as good. On the right, you have much better contrast. It's much sharper. And if you look at the perforations, which will always clue you in, there's multiple perforations printed through on the left, and there aren't on the right. So this print was put together from multiple sources. It's not, even the single print is not all the same generation material. So that's something it was just interesting. It's like, we think we're going back to an original source, but guess what? All these sources had their own history behind them. They didn't pop out of a lab pristine off a single original negative in either case. So returning to our 16 millimeter for a couple minutes, the reason it was included, obviously the titles were useless, was that it provided a couple nice opportunities for us to pick up footage that we didn't have, important sequences. One is there's a confrontation in front of Nellie's house, or Peggy's house in this case. So So this was an important sequence. Now, the continuity was there in the other films. In the 1924 reissue, it's gone. They come to this point, and then the title is The Next Day. So this was purposely excluded. In the Library of Congress, this part of the film doesn't exist. But the sequence does exist in the 16 millimeter, and it's very obvious where it goes. So there's no question like, well, let's just stick it in here. And it was just also interesting from our 1924 Flames of 49 that same sequence is featured in their, whatever it was, Tale of the Gold Country or whatever. Of course, all coins have two sides. So also in the 16 millimeter from Lobster is footage that has nothing to do with the half-breed. We don't know where this came from. There are about 3 minutes of a war party and a fire and guys in war paint dancing around and shaking tomahawks. It's not part of the half-breed. It's not even close. Not quite sure why it was made into the film, but you know, there's so many questions about that print, it's hard to tell. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. And a little demonstration and talk about putting it all back together. Now, with any restoration project, the key is to have a goal. The object of the game is like, let's put together every shot we can find, or let's put together all the titles and see what matches. So we had a very specific goal. Our goal is to get as close as we possibly could to the original July 30, 1916 release. That was the goal. So that guides your methodology to get there. An equally valid goal would have been to exactly restore the 1924 Tri-Stone re-release. That would have been equally goal. But either way, in any restoration, it's important to have a goal. It's not just to accumulate as much as you can. So keeping in mind our goal of we're trying to get back to 1916. And the reality is what we have here is not what people saw in 1916, but it is as close as we can get with the materials that exist. So going back to our three categories, continuity, titles, and image. So we went with the continuity that's described in the 1916 trade press and all the material that we have that exists. And also, quite fortunately, both the Library of Congress and the Cinematheque prints follow that continuity. So we felt very good about that. Almost shot for shot, they're in the same, where we have both sources, the matches are right there. Everything's in the same order. We had one situation where I had to move one shot around, where the Library of Congress had a shot before, and we moved it up to it. We moved the Cinematheque shot so it would match. But otherwise, they were spot on. For the titles, we went to 1916 Library of Congress wherever they existed. Every single title that's in that print is in this film. For situations and places where we didn't have titles, we went back to the 1924 Tri-Stone script from the collection at the Cinematheque and recreated triangle-looking titles to match, the Library of Congress version, the original versions. And then from the photographic perspective, we used the Cinematheque 35 millimeter just because it looks great. And frankly, even if it looked kind of okay, the Library of Congress photographic material is in such challenging condition, we really couldn't have used it. But there are essential shots from that source that we did include when we had to. And then the 16 millimeter, we filled in a couple of essential missing sequences, graded and matched and cleaned up as best as we could, so they were actually not too jarring. So with this in mind and using this methodology, next slide please. This is an example of the spreadsheet that we used to, this goes on for 123 pages, and it took longer to put together the spreadsheet than it did to clean the images, I will tell you that. But I just want, I'm going to read the text from every one of these cells. Over here it says, a time code, no. But I wanted to show sort of fairly intense methodology we followed to make sure what we got. So we have this block of what options we have in photographic images. We have our selection of titles to work through. And then this multicolored band up the, pretty close to me here, is what our final editing sequence for this little bit was. So shots surrounded in blue came from the Cinematheque. Those surrounded in mustard came from Library of Congress, so you can see a lot of Library of Congress titles in there, plus a couple photographic shots. And the magenta up there is one of our recreated titles. So, just a second on our recreated titles. Here's an example of one of them. On the left is an original title. On the right is the recreated one. And one thing that's very important to us and to any restoration project is it's sort of like show your work. We're creating this print so that people can see it and enjoy it now, but we also want, there's an archaeological or historical aspect to this. So ideally 200 years from now, people can look at this print and you're going to want to unwind what came from where. So it was important that we differentiated recreated titles from what was original. So all the recreated ones have tri-stone in the bottom right-hand corner to indicate that they came from the script. So a little demonstration of putting it all back together. And so what we'll see here is you're going to see the same sequence from the 3 different sources, and then you're going to see the restored sequence put back together. So we'll start with, and we go ahead and start this moving. So this is, again, from our Cinematheque 35mm. Again, all these are the raw scans, so these are all uncorrected and unrestored. And this sequence is interesting. You will see eventually, because as much as what's happening in the foreground, what happens or doesn't happen in the background. So we're coming to the church, and we've plopped the drunk guy down between the lady who's not too happy about that. And he raises his hand. We have one of the restoration titles. The drunk guy falls over, and then we cut to a title, and we leave the church. We leave the church and head to the Cardenas Woods, where we see Doug in his tree. Well, we see outside Doug's tree, and then we see Doug in his tree. And he pops out, looks around, and jogs away. And then we get a title saying that Pastor Wynn had invited him to church, which we know really can't be the case because they haven't met yet. But then if you look in the background, you see these people are picking up somebody in the street and carrying him away. And you see the figure walking towards us here. And then the pastor runs out to meet him. You see again, you're welcome. And again, the figure walking up behind them there. And here's a little bit of movie trivia for you. That figure, who is uncredited in the film, he plays the doctor. That's Elmo Lincoln. So that's your first Tarzan right there. So now here is the same sequence in Library of Congress. And as you can see, these are the exact same shots. They're not alternate takes or a separate camera. These are the same shots. But there's a difference. So we seat our poor inebriated gentleman again. Raises his hand. We go back, he falls over again. But wait, we go back to the pastor, and the fight breaks out in the street behind him. And we have a slugfest going on there that distracts everybody, and that's when the doctor leaves the church to see what's going on out there. Okay, then we go to Lobster. We don't have a church at all, but we do have Lowe leaving his tree, looking about. Exact same shot again. It's not an alternate take. He dashes off, but instead of an abrupt cut, we get another shot of him continuing on his way. It's obviously the same continuity. And then a fade out that actually gives you a sort of a nice transition, explains that, gives you some time to pass from showing up. So putting it all back together. Here we are, restored. A lot of the dirt, scratches, and emulsion damage have been have been addressed. It's graded as opposed to the raw scan, so you can see you get with a nice contrast here. And here's our drunk gentleman one more time. I bet he falls over again too. Here's one of our recreated titles from the Tri-Stone script. And he falls over. And now, to the extent possible, we've cleaned up the fight. So we added back the fight that happens in the street. So there's only so much you can do, but it's now stable, the contrast matches. We got as much of the regular dirt out that we could. But you do get the information, you do know what's happening in the sequence. Then we go to Doug and his tree. And this is back to the Cinematheque nice 35 millimeter. You're going to jog off into the distance. He's going to jog out of 35 millimeter land and into 16 millimeter land. But it cleaned up okay. You know, with the contrast and the stabilization and taking some of the dirt, I don't think it's as jarring as we were afraid that it might be. And now he's walking up, and there they are clearing the fight away in the back, and that makes sense now. And now we know why the doctor had left the church, and he's on his way back in. Another recreated title from the Tri-Stone script. She still doesn't want to sit by him after all these years. All right. So, it's finished. We have a negative. We have prints tomorrow at, I think, noon. For the very first time, that print's going to run through a projector. Hit the screen. This man's going to play along with it. It's going to be amazing. So there's two things left to do. Screen it, and I mentioned I think we'll do that. I hope you'll all be here. But even more importantly than it hitting the screen now, there's access and there's preservation. And once we have unspooled it for you, this print, along with our other restoration for this year, the last edition, the prints and the elements that we've created go to the Library of Congress. Well, they will become the first two titles of the San Francisco Silent Film Festival collection, both to be long-term stored and preserved, but also, and even I think at least as importantly, available for additional screening by whomever. The important thing to do is get these screen films back on the screen. We get to show them first, but the object of the game was to return them to everybody. And that's it. I would thank you all for coming. Thank you so much to the Cinematheque Française. They were an amazing partner for us. Tracy Gossel, it wouldn't have happened without her. And thank you for coming.